If you enter the National Gallery by the prominent central staircase and then continue into the central hall, a turn to your right will bring you to the galleries that contain the paintings of 18th century Italy and Spain. We will begin with Italy, as we have so many times in this course, and specifically begin in Venice, which had the liveliest artistic scene in the 18th century. Even a first glance at any painting by Giovanni Antonio Canal, whose dates were 1697 to 1768, lets the viewer know that we are indeed in a new artistic world. Independent landscapes had never taken on such importance before in Italian art. Trained in his native Venice by his father, a theatrical scene painter named Bernardo Canal, the son became known as Canaletto or Little Canal, but he was the greater artist by far. Canaletto was in Rome in 1719 and 20 working on opera sets. This was perhaps, I think, an important part of his training. By the mid-1720s, he started to focus on landscapes of existing monuments and spaces in Venice. These were referred to as vedute, or view paintings. Canaletto achieved great success, especially among English travelers on their grand tours of the continent, who had paintings by Canaletto sent home to remind them of the picturesque sights of Venice. When wars in Europe made travel more difficult for his patrons, Canaletto then went to England himself for much of the decades 1746 to 1756, depicting English sights. His last years were spent back in Venice. The 12 paintings by Canaletto in the National Gallery primarily show Venice, but two are English scenes. The basin of San Marco on Ascension Day and a regatta on the Grand Canal from about 1740 are large-scale examples of Canaletto's most popular scene paintings in the presentation of recognizable sights. They feature Venice at festival times when the city gathered in boats on the water and it was at its most colorful. And they are paired, showing a significant number of important buildings. Canaletto often worked in pairs. The basin of San Marco on Ascension Day shows the Doge's procession in the space of the Piazzetta, the open area in front of Palazzo Ducale, on its way to the Bucentoro, or ducal boat used for one important ceremony each year, and only for that ceremony. This was the wedding of Venice and the sea, a ceremony which took place yearly after 1178. A ring was blessed by the Venetian patriarch, the Bishop of Venice, and then tossed into the sea by the Doge. The mayor of Venice does it today. The choice of Ascension Day for this reenactment was associated with a celebration that began after the defeat in 998 of part of Dalmatia that had harassed Venetian seafaring. So we can see these are very old traditions. The Doge would be rowed out to the area called the Lido, symbolic of entrance to the Venetian lagoon. Since this early battle was said to have happened on Ascension Day, it became fixed in later centuries as the date of the ceremony. Ascension Day, when Jesus Christ rose to heaven, occurs each year 40 days after Easter Sunday. A regatta on the Grand Canal represents one of several regattas or races that took place annually since 1315 during Carnival in the winter months in Venice. Here we see the race of one-oared gondolas. The regattas took place on the longest straight section of the canal, of the Grand Canal. That is what we see here. At the far left is the Macchina, a temporary structure set up each year where the prizes for the winners were given out. Both paintings show the arms of the Doge, in this case of Alvise Pisani, Doge from 1735 to 1741. This documentary evidence and the style of the paintings lead to the assigned date of about 1740. The advantages of choosing such festive events as the pretext for the paintings are considerable. It allowed Canaletto to include many more figures and boats of all kinds in his paintings, adding further local color in both a figurative and a literal sense. Since travelers often came to Venice during Carnival, they might well have witnessed events such as the preparations for the wedding of the sea or a regatta in progress. Note that some figures in the regatta painting wear the white mask and black cape of carnival goers. These events were also a reminder of how venerable Venetian traditions were. What are some of the notable buildings we see in the paintings? In the basin of San Marco on Ascension Day, we see at the far left the prominent dome of Santa Maria della Salute. At the right are the Doge's Palace and the library. Between them is the piazzetta, that open place through which the procession is moving towards the stone quay called the Molo, where the Bucentoro is moored. Two columns stand at the Molo's entrance. Atop one is the lion symbol of St. Mark, the patron saint of Venice. On the other is St. Theodore, who was the first patron saint of the city. They were brought to Venice by a 12th century Doge. The large campanile, or bell tower, of the Church of San Marco is visible behind the palace. To the left of the library are the Mint and the State Granary, and that building no longer exists, the State Granary. A regatta on the Grand Canal contains few public buildings. This section of the Grand Canal was dominated by private palaces, many of them built or rebuilt in the 16th century. At the far left, as mentioned previously, is the elaborate Messina. Next to it is Palazzo Balbi, with two obelisks on its rooftop. Today, this is an administrative building for the regional government. On the right, moving from right to left, are Palazzo Erezzo, Palazzo Contarini, and the Mocenigo palaces. In the background at the right, we can see the very large Palazzo Grimani, now a judicial building. On the left, part of the Rialto Bridge. On the water are many bisone, or large boats with 8 to 10 oarsmen owned by Venetian nobles. They would be elaborately decorated for the regatta. Canaletto's popularity led him to develop a style that allowed for relatively rapid execution, even of such large paintings. He would work from compositional sketches augmented by on-site sketches made over time in a sketchbook he kept of specific parts of Venice. Compasses and rulers were crucial for creating an accurate perspective construction on top of the light-colored ground he used after the 1720s. For the topmost paint layer, he would paint the sky first, followed by the buildings and water, and last, the various figures and boats. By 1740, Canaletto's figures were painted with less detail and precision than in his earlier works, but they still convey the essential details of gender and social class. In Canaletto's art, the skies are always blue with only the slightest of clouds visible. Notice in this pair how in the basin of San Marco on Ascension Day, Canaletto suggests haze over water on the left side of the painting, clearing as one's gaze moves towards the right, while this subtly changing tonality is reversed in the regatta scene. The lighting on the buildings is always strong and helps us to read both their details and their spatial mass. Everywhere, the touch of his brushstroke is clear and confident, and if he had developed a kind of a shorthand, such as the curved strokes for waves in the water, that enabled him to paint quickly, it was a shorthand that also created a lively sense of surface. Canaletto felt free to alter the reality of the scenes he depicted. Thus, in the regatta scene, the Rialto Bridge would not be visible from the depicted viewpoint. Like Peter Sonrodon with his church paintings, Canaletto knew he was making a picture, not a document. It is not hard to imagine the pleasures such paintings would bring back in England to the former traveler and his guests, who can now visit Venice through the close inspection of these engaging paintings. It is instructive to see how Canaletto applied his style and vision to the English landscape. Eton College was painted about 1754, near the end of Canaletto's English period. And I hope that even at first glance, it might remind you of Jan van der Heyden's view of the Westerkerk, that Dutch painting from the 17th century we saw in Lecture 17, because indeed such scenes were very closely related to the earlier Dutch scenes. The school, located in the town of Eton, not far from Windsor, is seen on the far side of the Thames. The lighting of the scene is strong but not harsh and lets us see myriad details of the skyline of Eton as town and school, punctuated by the tall 15th century chapel. However, Canaletto did not pursue accuracy here, despite the fact that the painting can be associated with a preliminary drawing, likely done on site. A number of the details of the chapel's architecture, such as the domed turrets that we see, are incorrect, while some of the buildings of the scene, particularly on the left side for the town, are wholly imaginary, it appears. But let us not be stopped in our enjoyment by the hobgoblin of accuracy. After all, Canaletto was brilliant given a flat strip of land, buildings, water, and sky, whether it be in Venice or in England. We can enjoy this beautiful day, as do those who stroll or fish or picnic along the riverbank, or even those who punt on the Thames. These figures in this painting are especially droll, almost caricatural, yet they still convey a sense of engagement with their activities through just a few squiggles of Canaletto's brush. The scene is framed beautifully at the left by the prominent tree, which is depicted with subtle attention to nuances of lighting on the foliage. Canaletto could work on a big scale and yet still be a very delicate master. There was no greater painter of vedute in the 18th century than Canaletto. He did, however, have a worthy rival from the next generation in Francesco Guardi, whose dates were 1712 to 1793. Guardi was from a family of Venetian painters and sometimes worked with his brother, Gian Antonio. However, Francesco's career as a view painter seems to have started only in the mid-1750s, a few years before his brother's death. It is also unclear whether he ever worked as an assistant to Canaletto, as a few 18th century writers claimed. While Guardi's early view paintings were made in a style closer to Canaletto's, after about 1770 he developed a lighter, more nervous brushstroke and a slightly less precise approach to details. The National Gallery has a rich collection of 20 paintings by Guardi, many of actual sites and some featuring architectural fantasies. Like Canaletto, Guardi also worked in pairs at times, such as with Venice, the Doge's Palace in the Molo, and Venice, Santa Maria della Salute from about 1770. The first shows a similar scene to Canaletto's Ascension Day painting, while the second moves closer to a building Canaletto showed from afar in that same painting, Santa Maria della Salute. These choices indicate how iconic certain views and monuments in Venice had become. In Santa Maria della Salute, the point of view is approximately that seen from the Molo, right near the Doge's Palace. Baldassare Langena had designed the Church of the Salute in the 17th century, as well as the Customs House, the long, low building to the left of the church. We can see the domes of San Marco in the Doge's Palace and the Molo, as well as the full prison to the right of Palazzo Ducale. Canaletto showed us the Bucentoro at the Molo. Guardi depicted here the ducal galley used in all other important ceremonies during the year. Note how Guardi has a preference for depicting fewer picturesque motifs or anecdotes in his paintings compared to Canaletto. Boats are larger as well as fewer in number. His skies are even more active than his predecessors, and overall we might even call his painting technique impressionistic compared to Canaletto's. Guardi, for instance, did not worry if the windows on buildings were straight or not, as long as the overall effect of light shimmering on various surfaces was effective. The two artists' approaches to painting water were also quite distinct. Guardi did not depict individual waves, such as those of Canaletto, but used both horizontal and vertical brushstrokes to suggest the movement of water. Thus, there was certainly room for personal expression within the category of the view painting. Other more traditional subjects were still painted in 18th century Venice, however. Giovanni Battista Tiepolo, whose dates were 1696 to 1770, was the major painter of historical subjects in this period and followed in the tradition of Veronese as a great decorative painter as well. Trained in his native Venice by Gregorio Lazzarini, by the mid-1720s, Tiepolo had numerous commissions for frescoes and canvases in Venice and other Italian towns. From 1750 to 1753, he worked in Würzburg for the prince-bishop ruler there in Germany. In 1756, he became one of the first presidents of the Venetian Academy, founded only in 1750. His last years were spent in Madrid, where he worked for King Charles III. There are 10 paintings by Giovanni Battista Tiepolo in the National Gallery. An allegory with Venus and time from about 1754 to 1758 makes clear both Tiepolo's role as the inheritor of the great tradition of Venetian decorative painting and his modernizing of the same category. The shape of the canvas and the foreshortening of the figures makes clear that this was a ceiling painting. We can compare it to Veronese's allegory of love seen in an earlier lecture. Yet, even compared to Veronese, Tiepolo's style is much lighter and more delicate in paint application and conception of the figures. The subject seems to be the celebration of the birth of a child to Venus. She sits in her chariot in the clouds, while below her, Father Time holds the baby in such a way that he is presented to those who look at the painting from below. The baby, humorously, looks right at the spectator while sucking on a finger. Because Cupid is shown hovering beneath Time, the baby must be another child of Venus, and the best guess is that it is Aeneas, son of her liaison with the mortal prince Anchises. Above are the three Graces, and at the very top, two doves embrace and kiss. The lighting changes from the darkest area at the bottom of the painting and grows progressively lighter as the viewer's gaze sweeps upward. Similarly, Tiepolo has used the challenging space of this lozenge-shaped canvas cleverly. The most important figures were placed in the widest section of the lozenge, while more anecdotal details, such as the globe below and the doves above, were depicted in the narrower top and bottom. Like his hero Veronese, Tiepolo was a great colorist, but with the colors and shades we now associate with the first half of 18th century art. Different shades of blue, pink, and salmon guide our eye and mark off the more feminine realm of Venus from the masculine one of Time and Aeneas. Likewise, Tiepolo's far more delicate and slender conception of womanly beauty is far from that of the 16th century. Where would such a painting be placed? It has been suggested that it was intended for the ceiling of the Contarini family palace in Venice, likely celebrating the birth of an heir. Certainly it was there by 1758 and fits stylistically with Tiepolo's other work after his return from Würzburg. It was accompanied with 4 monochrome oval paintings with depictions of the virtues. We don't have to assume, however, that the subject was taken very seriously. Tiepolo was often a champion of the lighthearted portrayal of the gods, making clear that Renaissance idealization of classical stories was no longer seen as the only possible attitude towards such literature. If we turn to Rome, we also see the effect of tourist culture on the art of painting. Rome was treasured now more as a storehouse of history, for instance, rather than as a center for important history painting. One of the most popular artists at work in Rome was Giovanni Paolo Panini, whose dates were 1691 to 1765, who was a vedute painter in that city. Panini was born and raised and trained in Piacenza in northern Italy with specialists in theatrical scene painting and architectural painting. He moved to Rome by 1711 and first painted frescoes in local palaces. Within a few years, however, he began to specialize in Roman scenes, painting interior and exterior views of ancient and modern structures. His vedute paintings likely influenced Canaletto at the very beginning of his career. Rome, the interior of St. Peter's, likely painted before 1742, is a fine example of one of Panini's intricately depicted interior scenes. Like Canaletto's pair of Venetian scenes, this can be understood as a great big souvenir of Rome. The interior of St. Peter's was a very popular subject for Panini. He and his workshop painted many versions of the scene from about 1739 into the 1740s. The date assigned to this painting is based on the fact that changes in the interior decoration of St. Peter's that occurred after 1742 are not shown here but do appear in later versions. The advantage of such a painting over a photograph of the scene is that a painter can capture a much wider angle of view in such a vast space than a photographer can, at least without resorting to the distorting effects of a wide-angle lens. Here, Panini shows us the view down the nave of St. Peter's towards the altar marked by the bronze canopy designed by Gian Lorenzo Bernini in the 17th century. We get a sense of the truly awesome scale of St. Peter's and the richness of its decorations. People, including a cardinal, wander through the space looking tiny in it. Barrel vaults, arches, piers, the central cupola. We get a crash course in Renaissance architecture just by looking at this painting. Panini's style is not as compelling technically as Canaletto's or Guardi's, but his devotion to showing the monuments in such elaborate detail provides a way of experiencing the architecture second only to being on site. Painting in 18th century Spain did not generally reach the same level of creativity as it had in the 17th century, and its representation in the National Gallery is limited. Nevertheless, there are some genuine highlights for it, such as a painting by Luis Melendez that represents the continuation of the Spanish still life tradition. This had been important in the 17th century. We got a taste of that in the Velázquez painting of Christ in the House of Martha and Mary. The sobriety of Luis Melendez's art shows his devotion to a style of still life painting popularized the century before. Melendez, whose dates were 1716 to 1780, was born in Naples, where his father, a painter, was then working, though they soon moved back to Madrid. From his father, he learned to paint portrait miniatures and book illuminations. Melendez turned to still life painting in the 1760s and would devote the rest of his career to this subject, concentrating on Spanish produce and products. Melendez's still life with oranges and walnuts, signed and dated 1772 on the box at the right, shows the artist's rigorous concentration on just a few kinds of objects displaying limited color. The oranges provide the one high note of color here, while the rest of the painting ranges from tans to mid-browns to red browns. Walnuts, a few chestnuts, a melon, and oranges are nestled in with wooden boxes, a small barrel, and earthenware jugs. The simplicity of the objects on this bare table, set against a dark background, belies the rigor with which the artist conceived this painting. The composition builds up from lower left to upper right, while the melon, oranges, and plate of nuts line up from top to bottom. There is symmetry to the two boxes at the right that rest tipped up on a third rectangular box. Every object is lit with care, with a softened chiaroscuro playing across the whole, and textures are precisely evoked. Melendez clearly loved the play of geometry in such objects. Notice the echo of curves and spherical objects, the melon, the wooden barrel, for instance, against the linearity of the rectangular boxes and the table. As we saw with 17th century Dutch still lifes, such paintings can be seen as a meditation on the act of painting and the ability of the artist to create the world anew. An artist of great imaginative force would appear later in the century, Francisco de Goya, who, after rising through the ranks of the official art world in Spain, would become an astute observer and critic of society in his later career. Francisco de Goya, whose dates were 1746 to 1828, was certainly the most stylistically innovative and creative painter in Spain in the 18th century, who lived during a tumultuous time. Born in the town of Fuendetodos in Aragon, his family soon moved to the larger center of Zaragoza, where Goya trained as a painter. After failing to be admitted to the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Madrid, he went to Rome, returning to Zaragoza in 1771 and working primarily as a painter of religious subjects. In the mid-1770s, he moved to Madrid to become a tapestry designer. He would be active in this sphere until the early 1790s. Goya finally entered the Royal Academy and gained fame as a portrait painter, and was named painter to the king in 1786. After an illness in 1792-1793, Goya lost his hearing entirely, and while he continued to paint court portraits, he also began to make uncommissioned paintings of subjects unrelated to his official post. In the next 3 decades, Goya would witness the turmoil of abdications, invasions, and a brief experiment in constitutional monarchy in Spain. Many of his drawings and paintings of this period were devoted to social and political commentary, and he became known internationally for his etchings and lithographs. In 1824, Goya moved to Bordeaux in France when, because of his liberal views, he came under scrutiny by the Inquisition and the repressive government of Ferdinand VII. He made 2 trips back to his native country before his death in 1828. The National Gallery owns 5 paintings by Goya, including 3 portraits. Doña Isabel de Porcel was painted shortly before 1805 when it was exhibited at the Royal Academy in Madrid. It is signed on the back where the sitter's identity is also written. Her husband was a member of the Spanish ruling class, a government official, and a friend of Goya's. Here, though, she masquerades as a maja, a woman of the lower classes in Madrid, who nonetheless dressed and behaved stylishly. This led upper-class women of the late 18th and early 19th centuries to imitate their costumes and personal flair. The maja was a type Goya was drawn to in his art, but here he also needed to provide a flattering portrait of a well-connected woman. She is shown as attractive, sensuous, and even assertive in her active pose. The elbows here are thrust out in a way more commonly associated with male portraiture. But she still is not shown as breaking any bounds of real propriety. It's even been suggested that this is a dance stance that she is holding at this moment. It is a beautiful and subtly painted work with limited tones of pink, black, white, and brown. The sense of transparency of her black lace shawl over her dress is especially impressive. Goya has also modulated the background color in a way that reminds us of Rembrandt. X-radiography has revealed a curious fact. This portrait was painted over another one of a man in military uniform. Why Goya would not have chosen a fresh canvas for Doña Isabel's portrait is a mystery, given her importance as a client. Goya painted Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington, 3 times during the Duke's command of British forces in the Peninsular War against France. Wellington led British troops to defeat the Napoleonic army stationed in Spain that was used to prop up the reign of Napoleon's brother and the puppet king, Joseph. Goya first painted Wellington after the liberation of Madrid in 1812. A few months later, Wellington was bestowed the Order of the Golden Fleece, and then in 1814, the Military Gold Cross. He also visited Madrid again in that year, 1814. The portrait was modified at least once to reflect these increasing honors and to change his uniform as well. Despite these changes, it has a brilliant surface effect with the various colors of the ribbons, the sashes, the medals, and the dress uniform. It was unusually painted on a mahogany panel. Despite the attention to Wellington's heroic status through the accumulation of these medals, Goya conveyed a sense of the Duke as an alert, youthful, and even sensitive man. While the painter and the general were at different ends of the political spectrum in their own beliefs, Goya was grateful to Wellington because of his role as a liberator of Spain. The Duke would later serve his own country twice as a prime minister and was commander-in-chief of the armed forces. His grand London home, Apsley House, is now a museum and contains an equestrian portrait of the Duke by Goya, also painted in 1812. While the quantity of 18th century Italian and Spanish paintings in the National Gallery is limited, we have seen that the quality was not. This will also be true for the collection of 18th century French paintings, to which we will turn in the next lecture. Most of them fit into just one room in the National Gallery, but it makes a wonderful effect.